Hey guys, our Decline Average Picker. So continuing with our series of looking at challenge lock pins, I thought we'd take a look at serrated pins because after spools, I'd say serrated pins are kind of one of the other most common, and they come in a whole different variety of shapes and forms. And Dunn accidentally provided us with a lot of several good examples of serrated pins, and he's got some really clean serrations. This is probably what I would say is the closest to kind of your classic serrated pin. And so you've got a lot of just kind of rapid little cuts in there, but they're distinct and they're very clean. Let's see, let's look at this one. And then you find this a lot in challenge locks too, where 1, 2, maybe even 3 really well-defined serrations are cut near the top of a key pin, and that's just to kind of snag you on oversetting. And we'll talk about that actually in a second. And then we have some really poorly examples here. So this is sort of what I was just talking about too, where you may put in 1 or 2 fairly deep ones to help with an overset, though you could probably use this guy as a driver as well. This is a very early one I made using a razor blade, because there's a variety of ways to make that, and we're going to look at that in a minute. And that is really just kind of a random serrations made with a razor blade. And you probably saw this chewed up guy. This was very similar to this one. He was made with a lot of just kind of random razor blade cuts, but this is actually the one I used to use to experiment with a lot. And this can be kind of the result you end up with when you have a lot of little fine serrations. Focus. And then it gets chewed up in the lock from like over tensioning and things like that. And just after a lot of use, they start to kind of get a little more blurry and look a little more crunched up. And I'm going to insert a picture here too, because I would be amiss. The other one is Covert Medical, and I unfortunately do not have his lock, but he has these kind of very polished off serrations. So we're going to insert that picture here. Okay, so theoretically, what you're going to run into with serrations is basically they interact with the shear line, and in theory the shear line would end up grabbing every single one of those serrations, so you just get this constant click, 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 and you'd have to kind of fight your way past each one of them. In practice, that doesn't exactly happen. A lot of times, just because of the force you use lifting, sometimes you end up skipping past 1, 2, or 3. But these are all designed basically to snag the shear line. Now when you get into some like this, and like what we saw on Covert Medicals, where it's a little bit deeper of a cut, it can actually kind of fool you when you're picking into thinking maybe you have hit the actual shear line, and you move on to another pin. Of course, eventually you do realize you haven't, and you end up coming back to it, and you pick it up another notch or two. So like in this case, if this was a driver, you may pick it up to one of these two and think, you've gotten it. Eventually you're going to come back around, you're going to snag that last one. Now, making a serrated pin is not too bad. You can do it with a whole variety of different files. And I think I've mentioned before, Dunn mentioned he uses a jewelry saw to make his. I know some other people also use hacksaw blades, neither of which I have an example of, but I do have files. And you can make these fairly easily with a variety of files. But what you're really looking for is to use the edge of the file. Okay? And if you go too deep, you're going to end up with something more like a spool. So even something like this, now it's possible to come in on the pin that way. That doesn't give you the best. What you kind of really want to do to get a good serration, though, if you happen to use a flat file like this, is come in at an angle and try to catch that edge a little bit more. And then as you're filing, if you need to, you can kind of start to move the file a little more like that, perpendicular to it, and widen it up or whatever. It's the same even if you have like one of these. This one, I don't know if you can tell the video, it's slightly rounded, but again, just catch the edge. Just come in on the pin as it's spinning with the edge of the file and just get those cuts going. About the only one I'd say you can't use is probably a rounded file, because you really, to get a serration, you really kind of need that edge. And of course that edge is going to help dictate kind of how big or small or whatever they are. So the poor man's technique is to use a razor blade on the pin. And there's a couple kind of ways you can do this. While this is spinning around, you can come in with the razor blade. Oh. And if you can get a groove kind of started, you can just sort of do that and then sit in that groove and kind of saw it back and forth, and that'll give you a good deep serration. If you have a good sharp razor blade, like this one is not, while it's spinning though, you can get a lot of little ones almost by just kind of letting it bounce. Just make the cuts, give it a good push as it's going, but you're kind of letting the razor blade bounce and play around on the pin, and that's what gives you these kind of results. But like I said, if they get too fine, they get a little chewed up. Now, if you need to do one of those deeper ones though, and you want some just good ones, just a few good ones, you can sort of still use that same technique, because you're almost scoring or perforating the pin. And so what you could do is kind of let that bounce around, stop it, take a look at it, and when you see you've got a whole lot of little serrations going on, get it spinning again. You come in on the top one at an angle and apply some pressure down towards the Dremel or your drill as it's spinning, and just let the razor blade shave those bits off. Let me see if I can grab this one. And so if I wanted to make, like, let's say this one down here a little bit deeper as it's spinning, I would try to come in like that, and I would essentially let the razor blade cut that in-between serration off. When you do it, you really do want to do that kind of towards your Dremel or towards, what's going on with the color? This room is very susceptible to sunlight changes. But you do want to do that towards the Dremel or drill or however you're spinning it. If you do it going up, you either need to be really careful and really light-handed with it and just expect it to take more time, or expect that that's going to be enough pressure actually to send the pin flying out of the chuck and across your room. That's going to be quite normal if that happens for you. And that's just, because you're going to be pushing it out and away from it. That can happen the same as when you're using these files, if you are applying a little too much upward pressure as you're doing it. You really do want to get as straight across as possible, because if you do have a little bit of upward motion over time, you can end up flicking that pin out, especially if you just have it snagged on the very, very tip. And again, we're using Dunn's lock here. Another very popular thing to do with serrated pins is to thread the core and or thread the chamber, the driver chamber as well. And you can see pretty quickly what's the thinking there, and that is that the pins serrations are going to get hung up on each of these. So it's going to treat each of these almost as a false shear line until it gets up to the real one, or conversely, as you're going up on the other one. I'd say I'm not a huge fan of threading and serrated pins. It takes a little bit of experience, I think, and a little bit of practice to really get it good and right. What I've run into picking wise is, especially if you have a weaker spring up here, and you almost have to use a weaker spring. If you use too strong of a spring, of course, those serrations are going to get hung up with a heavy spring tension on your threading, and it's going to cause the key to jam up. And that jam up, though, is why I'm not a huge fan of doing this threading, because a lot of times what I've found is helps in picking, the pins will actually get stuck. And if you've watched any of my videos, you can probably see times where I've said, oh, I thought I only picked 3 pins. I didn't realize I'd picked 4. Maybe I did pick 4. Maybe I did pick 2 accidentally. But a lot of times what's happened is that pin has actually jammed itself in here, but it's jammed itself in the chamber, and the spring is not strong enough to actually be pushing it down into your core. And so basically now there's a pin you don't have to pick. So yeah, if you're not real careful and you don't get these real clean, and these are pretty good examples, and your serrations are too sharp, they're going to hang up in those chambers, and that can actually benefit the picker some. But yeah, keep in mind that you don't need that threading to make the serrated pin work. It takes very little to interact with the shear line, and so yeah, you don't need the threading. The serrations will still grab at that shear. So yeah, don't think just because you've serrated a pin that now you have to thread the core and or one of the chambers. You really don't need to. It's still going to hang up. For picking them, Helpful Lock Picker, his channel is awesome for straight tutorials. He's got tutorials on how to pick serrated pins. They're most notoriously found in these American 1100s that require really light tension. In challenge locks, that can vary. You can pick. And a lot of challenge locks are sloppy enough that you don't need the same amount of light, super light tension that you kind of do when addressing the 1100. That's what I thought made the Covert Medicals so neat. That lock was a fairly high tolerance lock, and those serrations were kind of deep and polished enough that it was really difficult to tell when the pin was set. There were a lot of times I was hitting those serrations while I was picking it, and I thought I had the pin just fine, and because they were so polished and the tolerances were well enough, a lot of times I was then pushing past the shear line and down into one of the drivers and grabbing those polished serrations as well. So there we go, just a brief look at serrated pins and the variety of them. We'll get Cameron Dunn's lock put back together now. But yeah, serrations and spools, they're kind of the cornerstone of challenge locks, and almost everything you find after that, where you get into these weird things where you don't know what to call them, a lot of those do tend to be just a variation of a spool and or a serration, or spools with serrations, or serrations with a spool element to it. There's some serrations that get deep enough, like I said, you cut it too deep, it starts to be a spool. So you get those two down and you just kind of start mixing and matching them. You can use the razor blade and go down the center of the spool and get those serrations in the spool itself. And that can cause quite a bit of hang up and snag as you're trying to pick. So yeah, there we go. Just a brief look at the serrated pins. I hope that's been mildly helpful for some of you. But yeah, you're gonna make these by accident. Probably they're not difficult to make. They're fairly easy, but they can be a little tricky to get to make them well, and to make them work really good. So there we go, guys. All right, you have a good one.